The fever has taken the valley, and the children are the first to fall.
The fever has taken the valley, and the children are the first to fall. The telegraph operator slammed a trembling hand against the wooden desk. He kept his head lowered, refusing to meet the desperate stare of the towering woman standing on the other side of the counter. The frantic clicking of the brass telegraph machine had fallen completely silent, leaving only the howling wind to fill the empty room. The pass is frozen solid. There is no man in this territory who can cross the ridge in a storm like this. The heavy silence in the room felt thicker than the bitter blizzard raging outside the frosted windows. Rowena stood like a statue carved from solid oak. Her massive shoulders rose and fell with heavy, ragged breaths. The thick muscles of her powerful arms strained against the cheap fabric of her solid gray dress. To the world, she was a terrifying force of nature, a giant of a woman built by relentless frontier labor. But in this small, dim room, she was merely a mother stripped of all her power. The life of her only child was trapped on the other side of a deadly, impenetrable mountain. Would you risk everything for someone who had already given up on themselves? Sometimes the greatest storms are not the ones raging in the dark sky, but the ones buried deep within a broken heart. Stay until the end of this tale to see if true courage can melt the coldest winter. And do me a kindness. Leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight, so I can see how far the story travels. Rowena turned away from the telegraph desk without speaking a single word. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping out into the brutal teeth of the storm. The biting cold immediately attacked her face, but she felt nothing but the burning terror in her chest. She had crossed oceans of debt, survived the cruelest labors of the frontier, and built a body capable of hauling timber and breaking earth, all to create a safe home for her daughter. She had left her child in the neighboring valley, just long enough to secure their new homestead. Now, the winter had closed the jaw of the mountain between them. The snow crunched heavily beneath her chunky leather boots as she marched through the narrow streets of the settlement. She possessed an incredibly powerful frame, with broad shoulders and thick, powerful thighs. The townsfolk often whispered about her intimidating presence, stepping out of her path out of sheer awe and misplaced fear. Yet, beneath that wild, rugged exterior beat a deeply compassionate heart. She walked to the very edge of the town, far past the warmth of the saloons and the safety of the general store. The shadows of the ancient pine trees swallowed the fading light of the afternoon. There, nestled against the foot of the jagged peaks, sat a secluded cabin. The comforting scent of burning pine and old leather hung heavy in the freezing air, a sharp contrast to the smell of fear that clung to the town. Standing in the deep snow outside the cabin was a man, Callahan. He swung a heavy iron axe into a massive block of timber with devastating force. The wood splintered with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty clearing. He was a towering frontier man, broad across the chest, carrying an aura of quiet, imposing strength. His sun-bronzed skin was heavily weathered by years of extreme elements. His sharp, observant eyes missed nothing, taking in the world with the wariness of a hunted wolf. His thick beard and slightly unkempt shoulder-length hair were dusted with white frost. He wore a worn work shirt and a heavy leather vest, his durable frontier trousers covered in sawdust. The sleeves of his shirt were torn, exposing the immense physical power of his forearms to the freezing wind. Rowena stopped a few paces away. Her breathing was harsh, pluming into the air like white smoke. "I need a guide." Her voice carried a quiet, desperate dignity. It was not a demand. It was a plea from the very depths of her soul. Callahan did not stop chopping. The heavy iron split another log, the rhythmic thud serving as a barrier between him and the rest of the world. "I do not guide in the winter." His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. No. Utterly devoid of any warmth. He reached down to adjust the timber, instinctively running a calloused thumb over a deep, jagged scar carved into the wooden handle of his axe. It was a subtle, protective habit, an anchor to a painful memory he refused to share with anyone. A sickness has struck the neighboring valley. The children are falling ill. Rowena took a step closer, her massive frame casting a long shadow over the snow. "My daughter is there." Callahan froze. The heavy iron axe rested motionless in the snow. He finally straightened his back and looked at her. He saw the sheer physical power of the woman before him. He saw the heavy exposed muscles of her biceps, the wild dust and sweat of hard labor permanently marking her face. Yet, when he looked into her eyes, he did not see a giant. He saw a profound vulnerability that shattered her imposing image completely. "The high pass is a graveyard." The words of the man were softer this time, though just as unyielding. "Any soul who attempts the crossing tonight will be swallowed by the ice. The mountain does not care about your daughter. It will only take your life as well." Rowena took another step forward. Her massive hands trembled slightly as she reached deep into the pocket of her gray dress. She pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It was her only valuable possession, a remnant of a life long gone. She held the silver trinket out toward him, the metal catching the weak light of the setting sun. "I will give you everything I have. Every coin I earn for the rest of my days." The voice of the mother broke, revealing the raw agony beneath her strength. "Please. You are the only one who knows the hidden trails." Callahan stared at the trembling hands of the giant woman. A flicker of profound sorrow crossed his weathered face, a shadow of an old failure returning to haunt him. He reached out slowly with his calloused fingers. He did not take the locket. Instead, he gently wrapped his rough hands over hers, pushing her massive hands softly back toward her chest. It was a gesture of quiet respect, a refusal to strip away the treasure of a desperate mother, even while denying her only hope. "Keep your silver. I cannot help you." The gaze of the man dropped to the snow. "I cannot watch another life disappear into the white dark." The words carried the crushing weight of a broken man. Rowena saw the truth in the sharp eyes of the guide. He was not a cruel coward. He was simply a man entirely consumed by his own ghosts, unable to bear the burden of another soul. She nodded slowly, swallowing the bitter taste of absolute helplessness. She turned away, walking back into the gathering gloom without looking back. The hours bled into a dark, unforgiving night. The promised blizzard arrived with terrible fury, rattling the wooden shutters of the town. Inside his secluded cabin, Callahan sat motionless beside the dying embers of his stone hearth. The warmth of the fire could not chase away the deep cold settling in his bones. The desperate plea of the towering woman echoed loudly in the quiet room. The image of her trembling, powerful hands haunted him. He stood up slowly and walked toward the frosted glass of his small window. He wiped away the thick condensation with the side of his heavy hand, peering out into the raging storm. The snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. The darkness of the treacherous mountain was absolute, an impenetrable wall of wind and ice. Suddenly, a slight movement caught the keen eyes of the guide. Far up on the dangerous lower ridge, moving directly against the sheer, violent force of the gale, was a massive silhouette. Rowena was climbing. She had no guide. She had no proper mountain gear. She was relying entirely on her raw, towering strength and her fierce maternal heart to force her way up the deadliest peak in the territory. Callahan felt his heart hammer heavily against his ribs, a sudden dread gripping his throat. She was walking straight into a frozen grave. The mountain did not care about the bravery of a mortal soul. The high peaks fed on the desperate and the foolish alike, burying their hopes beneath endless layers of white silence. Callahan knew the death waiting on the dark ridge. He strapped his heavy leather boots securely over his durable frontier trousers. He threw a thick wool coat over his broad shoulders, leaving the torn sleeves of his worn work shirt to peek through the edges. His calloused fingers brushed the scarred leather handle of his heavy hunting knife strapped to his belt. It was a nervous, recurring habit, a physical motion he used to ground his mind whenever the ghosts of his past screamed too loudly in the quiet of the cabin. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping out into the absolute fury of the blizzard. The wind howled like a wounded animal in the blackness. The snow blinded him, freezing to his thick beard within seconds. Yet, the towering mountain guide possessed a preternatural instinct for the ancient trails. He climbed the steep, treacherous path, fighting the crushing weight of the gale with the endurance of a man who had nothing left to lose. Far ahead on the brutal incline, the massive silhouette of the mother battled the elements. The sheer physical power of Rowena was a marvel to behold. Her heavy, muscular thighs drove through snowdrifts reaching her waist, breaking the frozen crust with relentless force. Her broad shoulders pushed against the solid wall of the wind. The simple fabric of her solid gray dress was entirely frozen, clinging tightly to the heavy exposed muscles of her back and powerful biceps. She was freezing, her breath tearing through her throat in ragged gasps. Yet she refused to stop. The burning love for her daughter provided a heat that the mountain could not extinguish. But raw strength alone could not defeat the shifting ice of the frontier. The heavy leather boot of the giant woman slipped on a hidden slab of black ice beneath the powder. Her massive frame pitched forward violently. The wind roared, eager to push her over the jagged edge of the steep ravine. A heavy, leather-clad hand clamped firmly around her thick bicep. The grip was like iron. Callahan hauled her backward with a violent, desperate surge of strength, dragging her away from the deadly precipice. Rowena gasped, her broad chest heaving as she crashed into the solid chest of the guide. They tumbled together into a narrow, dark crevice beneath a massive overhang of black stone, escaping the wind by a mere fraction of an inch. The sudden silence beneath the rock was deafening. The storm raged only feet away, blocked entirely by the heavy stone ceiling. Rowena struggled to sit up. Her massive chest heaved heavily with exhaustion. Her long blonde hair, wild and messy, clung to her frozen cheeks. She stared at the man who had just pulled her from the edge of oblivion. "You are a fool," the voice of the mountain man rumbled low in the shadows. "You nearly stepped into a drop of 1,000 feet. Rowena glared at him. The fierce, maternal fire in her eyes remained unextinguished. She did not shrink away from his imposing presence. She possessed a quiet dignity that demanded absolute respect. "I have to cross this ridge. I will not let my child die alone." Callahan looked at the towering woman. He saw the violent tremors shaking her powerful, heavy muscles. She was exhausted. She was freezing. Yet, her spirit was made of unyielding iron. There is a quiet magic that happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable sorrow. Callahan had spent years pushing the world away, hiding behind the walls of his own failure. But looking at the fierce determination of the mother, a profound realization washed over him. He could not turn his back on her. Not tonight. The broken pieces of his own soul recognized the terrifying desperation in her eyes. He reached into his rugged pack, He pulled out a heavy, dry wool blanket. Without asking for permission, he moved closer. He wrapped the thick fabric over her broad shoulders, his rough hands carefully tucking the edges around her freezing neck to block out the chill. "Drink this." He offered a battered leather canteen. Rowena hesitated. The instinct of the survivor warned her to rely on no one, a lesson learned through years of crushing hardship. But the deep, quiet kindness in the sharp eyes of the guide disarmed her heavy defenses. She took the canteen. The warm, spiced tea flowed down her raw throat, spreading a gentle, life-saving heat through her massive chest. It was the first beat of genuine warmth in a night of endless, biting cold. Callahan sat beside her, his broad shoulder pressing lightly against her incredibly thick arm. The narrow space beneath the stone forced them together. The brutal cold demanded they share their body heat to survive the long hours of the dark. Rowena looked down at the heavily calloused hands of the man. She noticed the way his thumb continuously rubbed the jagged scar on the leather sheath of his knife. It was a silent tell, a physical manifestation of a deep, hidden pain. She realized this towering, stoic man carried a burden just as heavy as hers. The silence between them began to change, transforming from the tension of strangers into the quiet understanding of two survivors trapped in the same storm. "Why did you follow me?" The voice of the mother was a soft murmur, entirely contrasting her intimidating size and heavy musculature. Callahan stared out at the swirling white wall of the storm just beyond their shelter. He did not answer immediately. The wind screamed its terrible song through the pines. "Because a grave in the snow is the coldest place in the world," the whisper of the man barely carried over the howling wind. "And nobody deserves to freeze alone." The confession hung heavily in the freezing air. Rowena felt a sudden, profound softening in her chest. She leaned back against the cold stone, allowing her massive frame to relax ever so slightly against the solid side of the protector. The grudging trust was born not from grand promises, but from the quiet sharing of a desperate shelter in the dark. She knew, in that silent, sacred moment, that this deeply scarred man would not let her fall. They sat together, in the dark, two giants of the frontier, shielding each other from the wrath of the winter. The long hours of the terrible night dragged by with agonizing slowness. The combined warmth of their powerful bodies slowly fought back the creeping death of the frost. Finally, the howling of the wind began to die down. The brutal blackness of the night slowly surrendered to the pale, fragile gray of the dawn. Callahan stood up slowly, his muscles stiff from the cold. He stepped out from beneath the stone overhang, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the fresh, deep snow. He looked up toward the high pass, his sharp eyes scanning the peaks. Rowena crawled out behind him, her boots sinking deep into the powder. She followed the gaze of the guide toward the heavens. The breath left her lungs completely. The entire side of the mountain was gone. A massive avalanche had struck during the night. Thousands of tons of snow and shattered timber had obliterated the main trail. Where a narrow, familiar path had existed yesterday, there was now only a sheer, impassable wall of white destruction. The way forward was completely erased from the earth. Callahan stared at the devastation. His broad shoulders tensed. He slowly reached down, touching the scarred sheath of his knife once more. "The pass is gone." The voice of the guide was devoid of hope. Rowena felt a crushing weight descend upon her heart. She thought of her daughter, burning with fever in a distant, isolated valley. "Is there another way?" she demanded, refusing to accept defeat. Callahan turned his head slowly. He looked toward the deep, shadowed chasm cutting through the eastern peaks. It was a place of permanent darkness. A treacherous scar in the earth that even the bravest timber cutters avoided. There is only one other path. He pointed toward the jagged black rocks towering in the distance. The ice gorge. The freezing morning air grew unnaturally still. The silence of the dawn felt far more dangerous than the howling storm of the night. But the gorge is a trap of shifting ice and falling stone. Callahan lowered his heavy hand, his eyes darkening with a terrifying certainty. Many men enter the shadows of the gorge. Very few ever walk out. The shadows of the ice gorge swallowed them entirely. The towering walls of ancient black stone rose on either side of the narrow passage, blocking out the pale light of the morning sun. The air inside the deep chasm was heavy, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of crushed pine needles and centuries of undisturbed frost. The temperature dropped instantly. The breath of the towering mountain man and the giant woman formed thick white clouds in the oppressive silence. Every step required absolute concentration. The ground beneath their heavy boots was a treacherous sheet of solid blue ice, hidden beneath a thin layer of fresh powder. The walls above them groaned with the terrifying weight of the winter. Callahan led the way. He moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a man who understood the deadly temper of the mountain. He continuously ran his rough, calloused thumb over the jagged scar on the leather sheath of his hunting knife. The rhythmic motion was a silent anchor, keeping his mind focused on the present danger, rather than the ghosts waiting in the cold dark. Rowena followed closely behind him. The massive, tossed, powerful frame of the mother absorbed the brutal punishment of the climb, without a single complaint. The bitter wind whipped her long, slightly messy blonde hair around her strong, resolute facial features. The harsh elements only seemed to amplify the quiet dignity radiating from her towering figure. The ice suddenly cracked beneath the heavy tread of the guide. Callahan pitched sharply to the left. His heavy leather boot lost purchase on the slick, frozen rock. He threw out his broad arm to catch himself, but the sudden momentum threatened to send him crashing down into a deep, jagged crevice beside the narrow path. A massive hand shot forward, gripping the thick fabric of his heavy wool coat. Rowena pulled him backward with a sudden, overwhelming surge of raw power. She planted her chunky leather boots firmly into the solid snow, her thick, powerful thighs acting as an unmovable anchor against the pull of gravity. She held the towering man entirely suspended over the drop for a terrifying second, before hauling him safely onto the flat ice. The heart of the guide hammered heavily against his ribs. He looked up into the fierce eyes of his savior. Step on the darker ice. The voice of the woman was a soft, steady rumble, and completely devoid of panic. The white patches are hollow underneath. Callahan stared at her. He saw the sheer physical power of the woman, the heavy exposed muscles of her powerful arms perfectly capable of shattering bone, yet acting with absolute precision and care to protect him. He offered a slow, silent nod of profound gratitude. It was a fleeting beat of genuine warmth in the freezing darkness, a quiet acknowledgement of the deep reliance growing between them. They pressed deeper into the gorge. The passage grew narrower. The towering walls of black rock began to close in, forcing them to walk shoulder to shoulder. The long hours of the morning dragged past, filled only with the rhythmic crunch of their heavy boots and the distant, terrifying groan of shifting ice. Suddenly, Callahan stopped dead in his tracks. The path ahead was completely destroyed. A massive, ancient pine tree had fallen from the high ridge above, crashing violently into the narrow gorge. The colossal trunk of the timber was as thick as a merchant wagon, entirely blocking the only way forward. The jagged roots of the fallen giant dug deeply into the solid ice, while the heavy, frozen branches scraped against the black stone walls on either side. There was no way around the obstacle. The towering rock walls offered no handholds for a climb. Callahan walked forward, placing his heavy, calloused hands against the rough bark of the massive tree. He pushed with all the immense strength of his broad shoulders. The heavy frame of the frontiersman strained until the torn sleeves of his worn work shirt threatened to rip entirely. The giant timber did not move a single inch. "We are trapped." The voice of the guide was heavy with grim certainty. He stepped back, wiping a layer of freezing sweat from his brow. "The roots are wedged into the stone. 10 strong men could not move this dead weight." The heavy silence of failure descended upon the narrow chasm. Callahan felt the familiar, crushing weight of despair returning to his chest. The mountain had won again. Rowena did not speak. She stepped forward, her massive silhouette dwarfing the space around her. She removed the heavy, dry wool blanket from her broad shoulders, letting the fabric fall to the icy ground. The biting cold immediately attacked the simple, solid gray fabric of her form-fitting dress. The sleeveless design exposed the incredible, heavy musculature of her powerful arms to the freezing wind. She walked directly up to the center of the massive fallen pine. She planted her chunky leather boots wide apart, digging the thick heels deeply into the blue ice for leverage. She bent her heavy, muscular knees, lowering her massive frame until her broad chest pressed against the rough bark of the colossal trunk. She slid her huge, calloused hands underneath the frozen timber, seeking a solid grip against the jagged wood. Callahan watched in absolute silence. He could not comprehend what she was attempting. The weight of the frozen timber was utterly impossible for any human being to lift. Rowena closed her eyes. The image of her daughter, shivering and burning with fever in a dark, isolated room, flashed violently in her mind. A deep, primal roar tore from the throat of the mother. The towering giant of a woman drove her heavy, powerful thighs upward with earth-shattering force. The heavy exposed muscles of her massive biceps and broad shoulders swelled visibly against the freezing air. The veins in her thick neck bulged with the unimaginable effort. The ice beneath the fallen pine cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. The massive tree groaned loudly. Callahan took a step back, his sharp eyes widening in pure disbelief. Rowena unleashed another guttural cry of sheer determination. She threw the entire, overwhelming force of her massive body weight forward. The impossible strength of the mother met the dead weight of the mountain, and the mountain lost. The colossal pine trunk lifted from the frozen ground. With a final, devastating shove, Rowena rolled the massive timber up and over the icy lip of the narrow trail. The gigantic tree crashed down into the deep crevice beside the path, shattering into 1,000 pieces of frozen splinter and raining heavy snow down into the abyss. The path was clear. Rowena stood gasping for air. The wild dust and sweat of her profound exertion coated her strong, resolute face. Her immense chest heaved heavily. She looked like a wild, victorious titan standing amidst the ruins of a broken world. Callahan stared at her. A profound, overwhelming sense of admiration flooded his chest. He realized, in that quiet, breathless moment, that the towering woman standing before him possessed a physical strength that perfectly mirrored the sheer, unyielding power of her immense heart. She was a true force of nature, driven by a love so pure that it could physically move the earth. He stepped forward, reaching out a rough, calloused hand. He gently picked up the heavy wool blanket from the snow and draped the warm fabric back over her broad, trembling shoulders. It was a gesture of profound respect. "You are a marvel." The low, gravelly voice of the guide held nothing but absolute reverence. Rowena offered a faint, exhausted smile, a rare softening of her imposing features that made the heart of the stoic protector skip a single beat. They stepped forward, crossing the newly cleared patch of ice, where the massive roots of the tree had rested just moments before. Callahan looked down at the freshly overturned earth. The deep roots of the pine had torn away a thick layer of permanent frost, revealing a hidden hollow beneath the stone. The sharp eyes of the guide suddenly locked onto a small object, half buried in the frozen dirt. He froze completely. The breath stopped moving in his lungs. He dropped slowly to his heavy knees. His calloused, trembling fingers reached into the display snowstorm. He pulled out a small, incredibly weathered ribbon. The fabric was stiff with age and frost, holding a faded, pale shade of blue. Rowena stopped, looking back at the kneeling giant. The towering mountain man stared at the small piece of frozen cloth in his massive hand. His broad shoulders began to shake with a violent, silent tremor. The face of the stoic protector drained of all color, instantly transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The silence inside the gorge stretched tight, thick enough to suffocate a man. Callahan knelt in the blue ice. His massive chest rose and fell in short, erratic bursts. He stared at the faded blue ribbon resting across his heavy, calloused palm. The weathered fabric looked ridiculously small against the scarred flesh of the giant frontiersman. Yet, to the eyes of the silent protector, it carried the crushing weight of an entire mountain. Rowena stepped closer. The chunky leather boots of the mother made no sound against the frozen powder. She looked down at the trembling shoulders of the towering man. She possessed an incredibly powerful frame, built by the harshest labors of the frontier. But she knew that the deepest wounds were never inflicted on the flesh. "What did you find?" The soft murmur of the giant woman barely disturbed the freezing air. Callahan slowly closed his thick fingers over the small ribbon, crushing the frozen fabric tightly against his palm. He did not look up. He simply shoved his massive fist deep into the pocket of his heavy wool coat. Nothing. The voice of the guide was completely hollow, stripped of all the quiet strength he usually carried. Just an echo. He stood up abruptly, keeping his broad back turned toward her. He immediately began walking deeper into the dark, narrow chasm, setting a punishing pace over the treacherous ice. Rowena watched him go. She noticed the way his calloused thumb frantically rubbed the jagged scar on the leather sheath of his hunting knife. It was a physical manifestation of absolute panic. The quiet understanding between them had suddenly cracked, replaced by a terrible, unspoken grief. She tightened the heavy wool blanket around her broad shoulders and followed him into the shadows. The brutal climb continued for hours. The deep gorge offered no sunlight, trapping the bitter chill of the mountain against their skin. The sheer physical power of the two giants allowed them to survive a journey that would have killed a lesser pair. But exhaustion slowly began to drain the heat from their massive bodies. As the pale gray light of the afternoon began to fade into a dangerous twilight, the jagged walls of the gorge finally widened. Callahan stopped near a steep embankment of dark rock. Hidden halfway up the slope, entirely camouflaged by the heavy snowdrifts and ancient pines, sat a small, rotting structure. The roof was partially caved in, and the heavy wooden door hung loosely on a single rusted hinge. It was an abandoned miner cabin, a forgotten relic left behind by desperate men chasing phantom gold. "We stop here." The guide did not wait for an answer. He climbed the embankment and pushed his broad shoulder against the heavy door, forcing it open against a wall of hard-packed snow. The inside of the cabin was remarkably small. The walls were constructed of thick, rough-hewn logs that managed to block the biting wind. A crumbling stone hearth dominated the center of the tiny room. The temperature inside was only marginally better than the open gorge, but the illusion of safety provided a desperate relief. Callahan immediately knelt before the hearth. He moved with silent, mechanical precision. He pulled dry kindling from deep inside his rugged pack, arranging the small sticks with practiced care. He struck a heavy iron match against the stone. A small, fragile flame sputtered to life. The sudden burst of light cast long, dancing shadows across the rough walls. The faint heat slowly began to push back the freezing dark. Rowena sat heavily on a rotting wooden bench near the fire. She let the heavy wool blanket slip down slightly, exposing the wild dust and sweat covering the strong, resolute features of her face. The heavy, exposed muscles of her powerful arms remained tense, a physical reaction to the relentless cold. The tiny cabin forced the two towering figures into profound proximity. They sat only a few feet apart, drawn together by the life-saving warmth of the small fire. Callahan stared deeply into the orange flames. The flickering light illuminated the heavy weathering of his sun-bronzed skin. He looked ancient, a man burdened by an invisible weight that was slowly grinding his spirit into dust. His heavy hand rested protectively over the deep pocket of his coat, guarding the frozen ribbon. The mountain does not forget. The voice of the mountain man finally broke the heavy silence. He did not look away from the fire. It keeps everything you leave behind. Rowena watched the deep sorrow etched into the face of the protector. The fierce maternal instinct inside her chest demanded she offer comfort, but she knew the pain of the guide was too raw to touch. She understood the agony of sacrifice. We all leave things behind. The voice of the giant woman was surprisingly gentle. A rich, lyrical sound that filled the tiny cabin with unexpected warmth. Sometimes, the hardest choices are the only ones that keep us breathing. Callahan turned his head slowly. The sharp, observant eyes of the guide locked onto the quiet dignity shining in her face. He saw the profound exhaustion hiding beneath her intimidating strength. You left your child. He stated the brutal truth without malice, merely seeking to understand the terrible courage of the mother. Rowena looked down at her huge, heavily collused hands. The thick fingers were covered in fresh, shallow cuts from the violent effort of moving the massive pine tree. I had to secure a claim in the valley, she spoke softly, staring at the small cuts on her flesh. The debt collectors in the city took the farm of my father. They took everything we owned. The city is a cruel place for a woman of my size. The respectable folks see only a beast of burden. The vicious folks see an oddity they can break. She paused, taking a slow, deep breath of the smoky air. I carried my daughter out of that misery on my back. She raised her strong face, meeting the intense gaze of the towering man. But the frontier demands a brutal price for a fresh start. The bank required the labor of 10 men to clear the timber for the new homestead. I did the work of 10 men. But a child cannot survive the deep woods while trees are falling. So, I left her in the safe care of my sibling in the settlement. Just for 1 month. Just until the cabin was built. The mother closed her eyes. A single, silent tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the wild dust on her cheek. I built a home with my bare hands. The raw agony in her voice cracked the stoic facade of the guide completely. And the very next day, the winter sealed the pass. I built a fortress, but I left my heart on the outside. Callahan stared at the towering woman. The sheer vulnerability of the giant mother struck him with the force of a physical blow. He realized that the incredible, heavy musculature of her powerful body was not a curse. It was the physical manifestation of a profound, sacred sacrifice. She had transformed herself into an unyielding titan, simply to provide a safe haven for the only soul she loved. A profound beat of deep attachment swelled in the chest of the silent protector. He saw the true worth of the giant woman. A beauty that had nothing to do with delicate features, and everything to do with unshakable honor. He slowly reached across the small space between them. His rough, calloused fingers gently brushed against the massive, trembling hand of the mother. It was a fleeting touch, a quiet promise of emotional safety in the dark. Rowena opened her eyes, surprised by the gentle warmth of his heavy hand. The fierce storm in her heart settled slightly, finding an unexpected anchor in the stoic presence of the man beside her. The quiet moment of deep intimacy was suddenly shattered. A low, collective growl echoed from the absolute darkness directly outside the rotting timber walls of the cabin. The deep, guttural sound vibrated through the rotting floorboards of the tiny cabin. The low snarl did not belong to the howling wind. It was a sound born of pure, desperate hunger. The sharp, observant eyes of the guide locked instantly onto the frail wooden door. The heavy, calloused thumb of the mountain man instinctively found the jagged scar on the leather sheath of his hunting knife. He rubbed the scarred texture twice. A silent, frantic preparation for violence. Rowena stood up slowly from the rotting wooden bench. The immense, powerful frame of the mother tensed immediately. The wild dust and sweat on her strong, resolute face hardened into a mask of pure defiance. She did not scream. She did not panic. She possessed the quiet, terrifying calm of a giant who had fought the cruelest edges of the frontier and survived. Step back from the timber. The voice of Callahan was a low, commanding rumble. He drew the heavy iron hunting knife from the leather sheath. The massive blade caught the faint orange glow of the dying fire. He stepped directly between the giant woman and the wooden door, offering his broad shoulders as a living shield. It was a powerful, unspoken gesture of pure protection. For the first time in her brutal life, somebody was standing in front of Rowena to take the first strike. A profound beat of warmth blossomed deep within the chest of the mother. Even as the shadow of death circled outside the walls, the heavy hinges of the door groaned in the freezing darkness. The starving pack did not wait. The desperation of the harsh winter had stripped the predators of all caution. The heavy wooden door shattered completely inward, exploding into a shower of rotting splinters and packed snow. The bitter winter wind screamed into the tiny room, bringing with it the rank, foul odor of wet fur and wild beasts. 3 massive mountain wolves poured through the broken threshold. They were terrifying creatures of the high peaks, gaunt and heavily scarred, driven entirely by the madness of starvation. The yellow eyes of the alpha locked on to the towering mountain man, standing by the stone hearth. The beast lunged forward with terrifying speed. Callahan did not retreat. The stoic protector braced his heavy leather boots against the stone of the hearth. He swung his massive, powerful arm in a brutal, sweeping arc. The heavy iron pommel of his hunting knife crashed heavily against the thick skull of the leading wolf. The sheer, devastating force of the blow sent the massive predator crashing violently into the rough-hewn logs of the side wall. The short, brutal sentences of survival took command of the room. The second wolf bypassed the guide entirely, aiming directly for the legs of the mother. Rowena did not flinch. The towering giant of a woman stepped forward into the strike. She reached down with her massive, heavily calloused hands. She caught the thick fur of the leaping beast in mid-air. The heavy, exposed muscles of her powerful arms swelled with unbelievable strength. She twisted her broad waist, utilizing the immense power of her thick, powerful thighs, and hurled the heavy wolf directly back through the shattered doorway into the freezing snow. The sheer physical power of the woman stunned the advancing pack for a fraction of a second. Callahan stepped backward, pressing his broad, not solid back firmly against the heavy, muscular back of the mother. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the center of the tiny, ruined room. The symmetry of their massive bodies created an impenetrable fortress of flesh and bone. Rowena felt the deep, steady rhythm of the heart beating inside the broad chest of the guide, pressing against her spine. A profound, overwhelming wave of emotional dependence washed over her soul. She had spent her entire existence carrying the impossible weight of the world alone, serving as the unbreakable beast of burden for the cruel whims of society. Now, in the darkest and deadliest moment of the winter, she finally had an equal. The strength of the mountain man perfectly matched her own towering power. They moved as one single, unstoppable force against the encroaching dark. Hold the left. The gruff whisper of the protector vibrated against her shoulder. I have your blind side. The rich, lyrical voice of the giant woman answered, without hesitation. The shared promise was a magnificent beat of absolute trust. The alpha wolf recovered from the heavy blow, shaking the snow from a bloody snout. The beast unleashed a terrifying howl, summoning the remainder of the starving pack from the shadows of the gorge. Two more gaunt figures leaped through the ruined doorway. The tiny cabin transformed into a chaotic swirl of fangs, heavy boots, and shattered timber. Callahan kicked a snapping jaw away with the thick heel of his leather boot. He kept the sharp blade of his heavy knife strictly on the defensive, relying purely on brute force and intimidation to drive the beasts back, rather than seeking slaughter. He understood the desperate hunger of the animals, fighting only to preserve the life of the woman behind him. A heavy shadow lunged from the dark corner of the ruined ceiling, directly toward the unguarded neck of the guide. Rowena saw the terrifying danger. She dropped the broken leg of a wooden chair she had been using as a club. The giant mother reached out with blinding speed. Her massive, powerful hand clamped tightly around the thick neck of the attacking beast, mere inches before the teeth found the flesh of the protector. The heavy musculature of her broad shoulders strained as she physically hauled the massive predator away from the man she refused to lose. It was a breathtaking display of raw devotion, proving that she was just as capable of shielding the guide as he was of shielding her. She threw the beast heavily into the burning embers of the stone hearth. The wolf shrieked, scrambling backward into the snow with singed fur. The alpha stood near the broken doorway. The wild eyes of the beast darted between the towering mountain man and the gigantic, unyielding woman. The predator recognized the undeniable truth of the wild. The two humans, standing in the flickering light of the fire, were not easy prey. They were titans, bound together by a desperate power that far exceeded the hunger of the pack. The alpha let out a low, defeated whine. The gaunt beasts turned away, disappearing silently back into the howling blackness of the ice gorge. The terrible siege was over. The heavy silence returned to the tiny cabin, broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of the two survivors. The bitter wind swept through the shattered doorway, immediately stealing the weak heat of the small fire. Rowena lowered her massive arms. The heavy muscles of her thick thighs trembled slightly from the massive surge of adrenaline. She turned around slowly, her heart swelling with profound gratitude for the towering man, who had faced the terrible fangs of the dark without a single step of hesitation. They are gone. The soft murmur of the mother sought to soothe the tension in the room. Callahan did not answer. The tall, broad-shouldered mountain man stood entirely still for a long, terrible moment. The heavy iron hunting knife slipped from his calloused fingers, clattering loudly against the freezing stone of the hearth. The stoic facade of the silent protector finally broke. Callahan swayed heavily to the side, His massive frame crashed hard against the rough logs of the cabin wall. He slid downward, leaving a thick smear of dark crimson against the wood, until he hit the floorboards with a heavy, lifeless thud. Rowena rushed forward with a cry of alarm. She dropped to her thick knees beside the fallen guide. The pale light of the fire illuminated the heavy, durable frontier trousers of the man. The thick fabric on the side of his leg was torn completely open. A deep, terrible wound continuously poured warm, bright blood onto the frozen floorboards, a silent testament to the lethal strike the guide had hidden during the brutal chaos of the fight. The life of the guide was pouring onto the frozen floorboards. Rowena pressed her heavily calloused hands firmly against the heavy, durable frontier trousers of the fallen man. The dark crimson flowed rapidly, stealing the vital heat from his massive frame. The freezing wind whipped through the shattered doorway of the small cabin, instantly biting into the exposed flesh of her powerful arms. "Leave me." The voice of Callahan was a frail, breathless rasp. The stoic protector struggled to lift his broad hand. His thick, trembling fingers brushed against the strong, resolute face of the mother. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking surrender, a quiet acknowledgement of his own end. "The blood will draw the pack back to this room. You must cross the summit alone." Rowena looked down at the towering frontier man. She saw the heavy weathering of his sun-bronzed skin, growing terribly pale. She remembered exactly how he had thrown his massive body directly between her and the fangs of the dark, shielding her without a single moment of hesitation. A profound, overwhelming wave of deep attachment swelled inside her massive chest. He was a man entirely broken by the ghosts of his past. Yet he had willingly offered his life to save the future of a total stranger. "I have spent my entire life carrying the heavy burdens of cruel men." The rich, lyrical voice of the giant woman trembled with fierce emotion. She leaned down, pressing her warm forehead gently against the cold, sweating brow of the guide. It was a magnificent beat of pure, shared humanity, an intimate refusal to let the dark claim him. "I will gladly carry the weight of an honorable man." She reached down to the hem of her simple, solid gray dress. With a sudden, violent surge of raw power, she ripped a long, thick strip of the heavy fabric. The sharp, tearing sound echoed loudly in the silent room. She wrapped the heavy cloth tightly around the torn leg of the protector, using the immense strength of her heavy musculature to bind the deep wound and halt the terrifying flow of crimson. Callahan groaned loudly, his broad chest heaving as the brutal pressure seared through his exhausted nerves. He instinctively reached his heavy hand downward, searching frantically for the jagged scar on the leather sheath of his hunting knife. He sought the familiar physical anchor to ground his spiraling mind, but his heavy fingers found only empty air. His trusted weapon rested forgotten near the cold stone hearth. Rowena knew the shattered cabin offered absolutely no safety. The fire was entirely dead. The freezing wind would turn the small room into a frozen tomb within the hour. The summit of the treacherous mountain remained miles above them. The towering mother stood up. The massive, incredibly powerful frame of the giant woman filled the small space with an undeniable aura of absolute defiance. She possessed the heavy, exposed muscles of a true titan, built by the crushing labor of a merciless frontier world. She had survived the crushing weight of endless debt, the cruel mockery of society, and the agonizing separation from her only child. She absolutely refused to let the ice defeat her now. She knelt beside the fallen guide. She wrapped her massive, heavily calloused hands securely around the broad shoulders of Callahan. She hauled his towering, heavy body upward. The silent protector offered a weak murmur of protest, but he possessed no strength left to resist the overwhelming, raw power of the woman. Rowena turned her broad back toward him. She hoisted the colossal weight of the mountain man directly onto her massive shoulders. The heavy wool coat of the guide pressed warmly against the back of her torn gray dress. The heavy leather boots of the man dangled past her thick waist. She stood up. The brutal weight of the giant man pushed heavily down upon her spine. The veins in her thick neck bulged wildly with the unimaginable effort. The heavy muscles of her powerful biceps and thick, powerful thighs strained violently against the immense burden. Yet, the chunky leather boots of the mother remained firmly planted upon the floorboards. She adjusted the massive weight of the man, finding a perfect, impossible balance. She stepped out of the shattered doorway and walked boldly back into the howling darkness of the ice gorge. The steepest part of the ascent loomed directly ahead. The jagged path of solid blue ice tilted upward at a terrifying, near vertical angle. The wind screamed wildly through the narrow chasm, throwing heavy sheets of frozen powder directly against the strong face of the mother. Every single step required a monumental expenditure of raw, towering strength. The chunky heels of her heavy leather boots crushed the frozen crust, finding secure purchase on the slick, treacherous stone hidden beneath the snow. The rhythmic, heavy breathing of the giant woman became the only sound in the freezing dark. Callahan rested his heavy head gently against the side of her strong neck. The profound warmth of her massive body seeped directly through his freezing clothes, keeping the fragile spark of life burning inside his broad chest. He felt the steady, incredibly powerful shifting of her heavy musculature beneath him. For the first time in his long, solitary life, the stoic protector did not have to stand entirely alone. The major turning point of their journey occurred not in a moment of dramatic battle, but in the quiet, agonizing endurance of the climb. He surrendered entirely to the overwhelming strength of the mother, trusting her implicitly with his shattered life. "You are the strongest soul in this territory." The whisper of the guide was incredibly faint, lost almost instantly to the howling wind, but the giant woman felt the deep vibration of his words against her skin. It was a beautiful, profound beat of absolute admiration and deep trust. "Hold on to me," she murmured softly, her rich voice pushing back the terrible cold and filling the dark space with a radiant heat. "We are almost there." The grueling climb lasted for countless, agonizing hours. The wild dust and sweat on the face of Rowena froze into a thick mask of pure ice. The thick thighs of the mother burned with a terrible fire that threatened to consume her very bones. Yet, the image of her sick daughter, waiting in the isolated valley below, pushed her towering body far beyond the normal limits of human endurance. Slowly, the oppressive black walls of the deep gorge began to fall away. The steep, treacherous angle of the blue ice finally leveled out. The howling wind lost the terrible, screaming edge, expanding outward into the vast, open sky. Rowena finally breached the high summit of the frozen mountain. The pale, golden light of the early morning sun spilled brightly across the endless expanse of the high frontier. The sheer beauty of the untamed wilderness was breathtaking. The giant mother stopped, her massive chest heaving heavily beneath the enormous weight of the protector. She stood at the very top of the world, a triumphant titan forged in the fires of relentless hardship and deep love. She looked down eagerly toward the isolated valley, spread out far beneath the jagged peaks. She searched frantically for the tiny cluster of wooden rooftops, desperate to see the familiar, comforting signs of life. She expected to see a dozen plumes of thick, gray smoke rising warmly from the stone chimneys of the settlement. Her blood turned instantly to solid ice. The remote settlement was completely buried beneath a thick blanket of pristine, untouched white powder. The small wooden houses sat entirely silent in the freezing shadows of the deep valley, completely undisturbed by the morning light. There was absolutely no smoke rising from the stone chimneys of the town. It was the ominous, terrifying signature of a deeply buried, completely dead world. The descent from the high peak demanded a completely different kind of agony. The steep, downward angle of the mountain forced Rowena to lean backward against the brutal pull of gravity. She shifted the colossal weight of the protector, wrapping his heavy arms securely around her broad shoulders. She supported his massive frame against her thick waist, half carrying and half dragging him through the deep, unbroken powder. Every step sent a violent jolt of pain up her thick, powerful thighs. Yet, the absolute silence of the valley floor drove her forward with a terrifying urgency. The small settlement below was a ghost town completely swallowed by the winter. The pristine, massed white snow covering the main street remained perfectly smooth. There were no tracks from heavy wagons. There were no footprints left by the heavy boots of the townsfolk. The thick frost clung heavily to the wooden signs of the silent storefronts, burying the windows of the general store beneath a solid sheet of ice. The terrible irony of her existence settled heavily upon the soul of the mother. She possessed the raw, towering strength to lift shattered timber and conquer the deadliest frozen peaks. Yet all the heavy musculature in the world could not rip a fever from the blood of a small child. The physical power that defined her entire life suddenly felt entirely useless against the invisible shadow of sickness. They reached the edge of the silent street. The heavy, durable frontier trousers of the guide were completely soaked with freezing blood, despite the tight fabric binding the deep wound. The face of Callahan held the pale, ashen color of crushed stone. "We need to find your kin." The gravelly voice of the mountain man was incredibly weak, a frail rumble vibrating against the broad shoulder of the giant woman. Rowena simply nodded. The fierce, maternal terror gripped her throat, so tightly she could not draw the breath to speak. She hauled the towering guide down the narrow alleyway, leading toward the small, wooden cabin she had secured for her kin. They turned the final corner. The heart of the mother stopped beating inside her massive chest. The wooden gate of the small yard lay shattered beneath a heavy snowdrift. The heavy timber door of the small cabin was swinging wildly on rusted iron hinges, slamming violently against the outer wall with every brutal gust of the wind. A thick, impenetrable drift of snow had blown completely inside the small entryway, covering the wooden floorboards with a blanket of freezing white powder. Rowena rushed forward, dragging the injured guide up the wooden steps. She kicked the door fully open with the thick heel of her chunky leather boot. The interior of the house was utterly abandoned. The small iron stove in the corner of the room was completely dead, radiating a terrible, biting cold. A small wooden chair rested on the floorboards, overturned in an obvious panic. A single, small woolen mitten lay forgotten near the ashes of the cold hearth. Rowena dropped to her heavy knees. She released her grip on the broad shoulders of the protector, allowing Callahan to slide gently against the freezing wall of the empty room. She reached out with heavily collused, trembling hands. She picked up the tiny woolen mitten from the frost. The sheer terror of absolute loss shattered the stoic, unyielding facade of the towering woman completely. A profound, agonizing sob tore forcefully from the throat of the giant mother. She pressed the small, frozen piece of fabric tightly against her strong, resolute face. The wild dust and sweat covering her cheeks mixed with the sudden, violent flood of hot tears. She had torn apart the frozen earth, battled the starving wolves of the gorge, and carried a giant of a man across the sky, only to arrive at an empty, freezing tomb. Callahan watched the towering titan break down. The stoic protector understood the crushing weight of an empty home. He instinctively reached his heavy hand down toward his waist, his thumb desperately seeking the jagged scar on the leather sheath of his hunting knife to ground his panicked mind. His thick fingers found only the empty fabric of his torn work shirt. The anchor to his past trauma was gone, lost to the blood and the snow of the high gorge. He looked at the weeping mother, kneeling on the floorboards. He slowly shifted his heavy, bleeding frame. He reached out with his broad, collar-used hand. He did not seek the phantom scar of his weapon. Instead, he wrapped his thick fingers firmly around the massive, heavy bicep of the giant woman. Breathe. The quiet command of the guide carried a beautiful, steadying warmth. She is not out in the storm. The snow inside the doorway is 2 days old. They left this house before the sickness took the warmth. Rowena lowered the tiny woolen mitten. She looked into the sharp, observant eyes of the mountain man. The gentle pressure of his heavy hand gripping her incredibly powerful arm anchored her shattering mind back to reality. It was a profound beat of pure emotional safety. He was bleeding and entirely exhausted. Yet he immediately poured his remaining strength into shielding her from the crushing jaws of despair. She offered a slow, shuddering nod. The profound emotional dependence between the two giants solidified in the freezing shadows of the empty cabin. Rowena stood up. The overwhelming panic slowly transformed back into the fierce, terrifying resolve of a mother. She quickly gathered the remaining dry blankets from a nearby wooden trunk. She gently wrapped the heavy fabric securely around the broad, trembling shoulders of the guide, ensuring he retained his vital body heat in the freezing room. Stay here. The rich, lyrical voice of the woman carried the undeniable authority of the frontier. I will search the other cabins. Callahan offered a faint nod, pulling the heavy blankets tightly against his chest. Rowena stepped back out through the swinging wooden door. The bitter wind immediately whipped her long, messy blonde hair across her face. She marched heavily into the center of the silent street. The enormous frame of the woman stood like an unmovable monument of pure defiance against the pale winter sun. Suddenly, a harsh, ragged coughing sound echoed from the dark shadows of a narrow alleyway across the street. Rowena turned sharply. Her thick, powerful thighs propelled her massive body through the deep snow with terrifying speed. An old, frail man stumbled out from behind a frozen wagon. The thin neighbor clutched a dirty rag over his mouth. His sunken eyes widened in sheer disbelief as he looked up at the towering, muscular giant of a woman charging toward him. He recognized the imposing figure immediately. Where are they? The desperate demand tore forcefully from the broad chest of the mother. She stopped just inches away from the frail man, her massive silhouette blocking out the sun entirely. Where is the daughter of my kin? The old neighbor shrank back against the frozen wood of the wagon. He coughed violently, his thin body shaking with a terrible effort. He slowly lowered the dirty rag from his mouth. He did not speak a single word. He raised a trembling, pale finger. Rowena followed the direction of the shaking hand. At the very edge of the isolated settlement, situated far away from the warmth of the other cabins, stood the large wooden church of the valley. The tall, frosted windows of the chapel were entirely boarded shut with heavy, jagged planks of raw timber. A thick, dark column of foul-smelling smoke billowed sluggishly from the stone chimney of the roof. But it was the heavy, iron chains wrapped tightly around the dual wooden handles of the front doors that sent a paralyzing wave of dread through the very soul of the mother. The heavy iron locks were secured entirely from the outside. The heavy iron chains clinked against the frosted timber doors of the chapel. Rowena stood in the middle of the frozen mud of the yard. The immense frame of the woman was utterly motionless. Her broad shoulders remained rigid, her breathing shallow and fast. She had hauled a massive man across a frozen mountain and torn open her hands on ancient timber, only to find the final obstacle forged in iron and padlocked by fear. The townsfolk had chained the chapel doors from the outside. They had quarantined the sick inside the dark sanctuary, leaving them to burn with the fever, while the healthy huddled in distant cabins. The giant mother walked up the 3 wooden steps. She ignored the bitter wind tearing at her torn gray dress. She reached out with her massive, heavily calloused hands, wrapping her thick fingers around the cold iron links. She pulled. The heavy chains groaned, biting deeply into the frozen wood of the door. But the forged metal did not snap. Step away from the threshold. The low, gravelly voice of the mountain man cut through the silence of the yard. Rowena turned her head. Callahan was limping across the snow. He had dragged his bleeding frame out of the empty cabin, refusing to let her face the horror alone. The thick blankets were draped over his broad shoulders, trailing in the white powder. He looked terrible, his sun-bronzed skin as pale as limestone, but his sharp, observant eyes burned with a terrifying, protective light. He reached the bottom of the wooden steps. He did not ask her to move. He simply raised his heavy, calloused boot and slammed his heel into the rusted iron padlock hanging from the center of the chain. The lock shattered. The heavy chain fell into the snow with a dull clatter. Rowena pushed both wooden doors violently inward. The sudden darkness of the sanctuary swallowed them instantly. The air inside the large room was thick, humid, and heavy with the terrible scent of sweat, burning sage, and death. A small, roaring fire crackled within the iron stove near the altar, but the heat merely amplified the stifling, tragic atmosphere of the quarantined hall. Dozens of iron cots were crammed tightly together along the wooden pews. Frail, trembling figures lay beneath thin wool blankets, their skin slick with the freezing sweat of the mountain fever. Rowena marched down the central aisle. The heavy, chunky heels of her leather boots banged loudly against the bare floorboards. The massive, towering woman looked like a vengeful titan stepping into the underworld. She scanned the rows of suffering faces. She bypassed the old, the weary, and the frail, her desperate eyes searching for a small, familiar frame. Near the far corner of the altar, lying on a narrow iron cot, was a tiny girl. The young child was shivering violently beneath a heavy quilt. Her blonde hair, damp with sweat, clung tightly to her pale forehead. Her shallow breathing rattled painfully in her small chest. Rowena dropped to her thick knees. The immense, powerful frame of the mother collapsed into profound vulnerability. She reached out her massive, heavily calloused hands and gently lifted the small child into her broad, muscular chest. "I am here," the rich, lyrical voice of the giant woman broke, wrapping the tiny girl in a warm, radiant blanket of pure, unconditional love. "I am here, my little bird. You are safe now." The young child opened her heavy, feverish eyes. She looked up at the strong, resolute face of her mother. A weak, pathetic cough tore through her throat, but a tiny, fragile smile touched her pale lips. She wrapped her frail arms around the thick bicep of the giant woman, sinking deeply into the overwhelming physical safety of her massive frame. Rowena held her daughter tightly, allowing the agonizing tears to fall freely onto the heavy quilt. The fierce, terrifying storm in her soul finally settled, finding absolute peace in the simple, rhythmic beating of the small heart against her ribs. A heavy, dragging footstep echoed on the floorboards behind her. Callahan limped down the aisle. He leaned heavily against the wooden pews for support, his bleeding leg leaving a faint, dark smear along the clean wood. He reached the iron cot and looked down at the pale, sweating child resting against the massive chest of the mother. The sharp, observant eyes of the guide suddenly locked onto the flushed cheeks of the girl. The heavy weathering of his sun-bronzed skin drained of all color. He took a staggering step backward, his broad shoulders trembling violently. He had seen this exact fever before. He stared at the small, ragged breaths of the child, and the terrible memories of a distant winter violently tore open the scars in his mind. This is not the common lung chill. The low, trembling voice of the mountain man barely carried over the crackling of the iron stove. He dropped his heavy hand against the empty pocket of his wool coat, searching frantically for the phantom ribbon he had lost in the gorge. This is the black frost fever, the sickness that crawls from the deep mines. Rowena looked up. She saw the absolute terror shining in the sharp eyes of the protector. The fierce maternal instinct inside her chest flared instantly, shielding her child against the new, terrifying threat. Can it be cured? The demand of the mother was a low, dangerous rumble. Callahan closed his eyes. He remembered his own family, lying in the cold earth of a different valley, entirely consumed by this exact plague. He remembered his complete, devastating failure to save them. A profound wave of shared heartbreak crashed over his soul, reminding him why he had isolated himself on the edge of the frontier. The mountain was giving him a second chance to fight the ghosts of his past. He opened his eyes. The terror in his gaze surrendered to a fierce, undeniable purpose. It can be cured. The guide spoke with absolute, terrifying certainty. But the remedy does not exist in this valley. The medicine requires the roots of the silverleaf pine, and the rare frost moss that grows only inside the deep caverns of the high ridge. He looked down at his own heavily bandaged, bleeding leg. The ingredients must be harvested fresh from the mountain, before the sun sets today. Callahan lowered his observational gaze toward the wooden floorboards, his broad frame swaying with exhaustion. But the journey back up the trail requires a full day of climbing, and the storm has ruined the lower paths. The wooden sanctuary of the chapel provided little protection against the relentless, biting chill of the mountain air. The wind howled through the gaps in the timber walls, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. Callahan looked at the shivering child, then down at his own heavily bandaged leg. The wound of the guide throbbed with a dull, persistent fire, a constant reminder of the physical cost of his dedication. He had spent his entire existence running from the ghosts of his own failure, believing that some debts could never be paid and some lives could never be saved. Yet, looking at the fierce, unyielding determination in the eyes of Rowena, he felt the heavy and suffocating weight of his past begin to shift. He leaned heavily against the wooden pew, his broad, solid frame swaying with exhaustion. I will go. The voice of the mountain man was a low, steady rumble that commanded absolute attention. I know the secret caves where the frost moss grows. I can make the ascent before the light fails. Rowena looked up from the iron cot. She gripped the hand of her child, her massive, heavily collused fingers dwarfing the tiny, pale wrist of the girl. Her fierce, maternal gaze met the sharp, observant eyes of the guide. She saw the undeniable truth etched into his weathered face. He was in immense pain. His body was failing, but his spirit was burning with the same singular purpose that consumed her own. She did not argue. She did not plead. She understood that trust was not about stripping away the autonomy of the protector, but about accepting the sacrifice required to win the war. Do not let the mountain take you. The lyrical voice of the woman carried a quiet, terrifying strength. Callahan offered a slow, solemn nod. He reached out with his broad, calloused hand, pressing his palm gently against the shoulder of the giant mother. It was a brief, powerful connection, a silent transfer of courage that resonated deep within the chest of both survivors. The intimacy of the gesture, occurring in the midst of sickness and death, created a profound beat of emotional safety that anchored them against the howling storm. He turned away, limping toward the double doors of the chapel. He did not look back. He simply stepped out into the blinding white fury of the winter, his towering silhouette disappearing into the swirling drifts within a matter of seconds. Rowena turned her entire focus back to her daughter. The child was burning with a terrible, unnatural heat. The sickness of the black frost fever was a cruel thief, stripping the vitality from the small frame of the girl with ruthless efficiency. The giant mother acted with the instinct of a force of nature. She stripped away the heavy, damp blankets from the cot. She unbuttoned her own simple, solid gray dress, exposing the layer of warm, protective linen beneath. She climbed onto the narrow iron cot, pulling her daughter firmly into the immense, powerful embrace of her own body. She focused entirely on the art of survival. She created a sanctuary of human heat. The massive, thick thighs of the woman curled around the frail limbs of the child, shielding her from the freezing air. The broad, strong chest of the mother pressed against the back of the girl, serving as a living, breathing barrier against the chill of the fever. The hours stretched into an endless, agonizing vigil. Rowena did not sleep. She did not move. She remained an absolute, unmoving monument of maternal endurance. She whispered, soft, ancient lullabies into the wild, messy blonde hair of her daughter. Her voice, a low, steady rhythm that pulsed through the silent chapel. She poured every ounce of her remaining energy into the task of keeping the small flame of life burning against the encroaching darkness. Outside, the storm raged with the fury of a wounded beast. But inside the narrow cot, the temperature began to change. The violent, shaking tremors of the girl slowly subsided. The unnatural, dry heat of the fever began to break, replaced by a deep, damp chill. The child let out a long, shuddering breath, her small body relaxing against the immense frame of her mother. Rowena felt the change, a surge of profound relief, so powerful it brought tears to her eyes, flooded her soul. The heavy doors of the chapel groaned. The howling wind screamed into the sanctuary, followed by the heavy, crunching steps of frozen boots. Callahan stumbled through the entrance. The towering mountain man was completely coated in a thick layer of ice and fresh snow. He looked like a statue carved from the mountain itself. His breath came in shallow, labored gasps. He moved toward the altar with a clumsy, disjointed gait. He fell to his heavy knees before the iron stove, his massive, calloused hands trembling violently. He opened his leather satchel. He pulled out a handful of silver-leaf pine needles and a small, tangled clump of frozen, glowing frost moss. Rowena gently placed her daughter back onto the mattress, covering her with clean, warm wool. She stood up, her massive, powerful legs stiff from the long hours of immobility. She hurried to the side of the protector. "You did it." The voice of the woman was a soft, awed whisper. Callahan did not speak. He dumped the ingredients into the boiling pot of water, resting upon the iron stove. He stirred the mixture with a piece of charred wood, his movements mechanical and painfully slow. Drink. He finally managed to choke out the single word. Rowena took the steaming, pungent tin mug from his hands. She carefully lifted the head of her daughter, pressing the bitter herbal brew against the pale lips of the girl. The child swallowed a tiny, instinctive movement that signaled the beginning of her return from the edge of the abyss. Callahan collapsed backward, his broad, solid back hitting the cold stone of the floor. His heavy eyes closed. The intense, burning purpose that had driven him up the mountain was suddenly extinguished, leaving only the crushing exhaustion of a man who had pushed his body far beyond the threshold of total collapse. Rowena rushed to his side. She reached out, placing her massive, strong hand upon his chest. She felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath his torn shirt. He was alive. She turned to go to the kitchen area to find more wood for the fire, but she stopped dead in her tracks. The heavy, double doors of the chapel were flung wide open. The freezing wind roared into the room. But it was not the winter that stole the air from the lungs of the mother. A group of 5 men stood in the threshold. They were local townsfolk, led by a man with a thick, silver badge pinned to his heavy wool coat. The sheriff. He held a long, double-barreled shotgun. His eyes narrowed with a mixture of fear and cold, calculated malice. "We told you to leave the valley." The voice of the sheriff was sharp, biting, and entirely devoid of mercy. "We know about the fever in this house. We know you brought the sickness of the high peaks down into our streets." Rowena stepped forward, placing her massive, towering body directly between the armed men and the iron cot of her sleeping child. Her broad shoulders expanded. The heavy, exposed muscles of her powerful arms remained tense, ready to unleash a devastation that would shatter the intruders before they could draw a single breath. "My child is healing." The voice of the woman was a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the high rafters of the chapel. "Do not take another step." The sheriff raised the barrel of the shotgun, leveling the weapon directly at the center of her broad chest. "We do not care about your child," the sheriff sneered, his gaze shifting to the unconscious form of Callahan lying on the floor. "The town council has decided that every soul inside this building is a danger to the safety of our homes. We are locking the doors from the outside, and we are not coming back." The finality of the words hit the room with the force of a falling mountain. Rowena stood alone, facing the cold, iron reality of the law. What would you do if the very people who were supposed to protect you decided that you were the danger? Would you submit to the cruel judgment of the crowd? Or would you find the strength to fight for the right to simply exist? The sheriff took a deliberate step forward, his thumb pulling back the heavy hammer of the shotgun with a sharp, metallic click. "Leave now," the sheriff commanded, his eyes filled with a terrifying, hollow resolve. "Or you will never leave this valley alive." The double-barreled shotgun wavered in the grip of the sheriff. He was a man built of soft edges and hard prejudices, a creature of the low valley who feared what he could not control. He stared at the woman standing before him. Rowena did not shrink. She did not raise her hands in surrender. She expanded. She widened her stance. The massive, heavily calloused feet of the giant woman sinking into the rough floorboards of the chapel. The heavy, exposed muscles of her powerful arms remained coiled, ready to shatter the bones of any man who dared to threaten her child. She was not a beast, but she was a mother, and the protective fire in her eyes promised a destruction that the law-abiding men in the doorway could not comprehend. The sheriff blinked, his thumb still pulling against the resistance of the heavy hammer. He expected her to run. He expected the typical, frantic scramble of the desperate. Instead, he faced an unmovable monolith of defiance. A ragged, deep intake of air echoed from the floor near the altar. The heavy, leather-clad boots of the mountain man scraped against the wood. Callahan pushed his broad, solid frame upward. He used the edge of an iron pew to hoist his massive body. His face was a mask of pale agony, yet his sharp, observant eyes were burning with a cold, terrifying light. He stood to the left of the giant woman. He did not pull his knife. He did not need to. He simply stood, his towering stature and broad shoulders casting a long, deep shadow that swallowed the front pew entirely. The men in the doorway shifted. The presence of the two giants was a physical weight in the small, humid room. Callahan was a man who lived in the places the town dared not go. He was the ghost of the high peaks, the man who had survived the wolves and the ice. His silence was louder than the threat of any iron weapon. The sheriff looked at the mountain man, then back to the titan of a woman guarding the cot. He saw the way the woman placed her hand on the arm of the guide. A silent, powerful anchor of unity. They did not look like outcasts or criminals. They looked like an army of two. Step aside. The sheriff attempted to summon his authority, but his voice cracked, betraying the sudden, frantic beat of his heart. This is for the good of the valley. Rowena did not move. She tilted her head slightly, her long, messy blonde hair falling across her strong, resolute face. The sickness is broken. The rich, lyrical voice of the woman filled the sanctuary, carrying the weight of an ancient, unavoidable truth. My daughter lives. We are not a danger to this town. You are an infection. The sheriff gestured with the shotgun, his gaze darting toward the other men for support. None of them moved forward. The men of the town knew the strength of the hands that had cleared the massive, ancient pine from the gorge. They had heard the whispers of the feats performed by the giant mother. The intimidation that had once driven the townsfolk to fear her was suddenly redirected, focused on the potential cost of their own survival. To kill these two would require a massacre, and the men standing in the threshold did not have the stomach for such a dark, permanent price. Callahan took a single, heavy step forward. The floorboards groaned beneath his massive frame. He did not speak. He did not growl. He simply looked at the sheriff, his sharp, observant eyes devoid of any fear. He was a man who had stared into the maw of death every day for the past 10 years. A shotgun barrel was nothing compared to the howling void of the winter. The sheriff recoiled. He realized, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that he was looking into the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. The weapon in his hands felt suddenly heavy, useless, and absurd. "If you do not move," Rowena murmured, her voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the very foundation of the building. "The next thing you will touch is the earth." The sheriff thought broke. He lowered the shotgun, his face turning a mottled shade of red. He stepped backward, stumbling over the threshold of the wooden doors. The other men followed immediately, eager to retreat from the suffocating, powerful atmosphere of the chapel. "You are fools," the sheriff spat, though he did not stop walking. "You think you have won? You have only chosen a different way to die." He turned back once more, his gaze flickering between the towering mountain man and the giant mother. The barometer has dropped lower than I have ever seen it in my life. The voice of the sheriff was filled with a bitter, vindictive satisfaction. A superstorm is arriving in 1 hour. It will be the largest blizzard this valley has seen in a century. It will trap every living thing inside this canyon. The mountain will be impassable for months. The sheriff turned his back on them, marching toward the distant line of wooden houses. If you are still in this valley when the sun sets, you will never leave. The heavy doors of the chapel slammed shut, sealing the two giants inside the dim, stifling sanctuary. Rowena exhaled, the sound trembling in the sudden silence. She turned to look at the child, who remained breathing in a deep, peaceful sleep. She then looked toward Callahan. The mountain man was still standing, but his posture was drooping, his broad shoulders bowing under the immense exhaustion of his wounded body. The adrenaline that had fueled his confrontation was rapidly draining away, leaving him hollow. He looked toward the high, boarded windows of the chapel. The light of the afternoon was already turning a deep, bruised purple. The air was growing colder, the wind beginning to scream around the corners of the wooden walls. He is right about the storm. The voice of the guide was a hollow whisper. The mountain is preparing to close its doors. Rowena walked to the center of the room. She looked at her sleeping daughter, then back at the man who had fought beside her. She possessed an incredibly powerful frame, capable of carrying a grown man over frozen peaks. But she knew the physical reality of the situation. We cannot stay here. The giant mother spoke with a terrifying clarity. The town will return with more than a shotgun if we remain. Callahan sank back down onto the wooden floorboards, his heavy, bleeding leg outstretched. He looked at the massive, strong hands of the woman. Then we must climb. The mountain man closed his eyes. But I cannot carry her, and I cannot walk the pass in my condition. The silence in the room became absolute. The challenge was impossible. They had saved the child from the fever, but the mountain was now threatening to bury them all in a tomb of white ice. Rowena knelt beside the guide. She reached out, placing her massive, calloused hand upon his broad shoulder. You carried the weight of my protection. The woman looked into his weary, sharp eyes. Now, I will carry the weight of our future. She stood up and walked toward the iron stove. She began to pack the remaining medicinal supplies into her leather satchel. Her movements were precise, efficient, and entirely devoid of hesitation. She was a woman who had built a home from nothing, and she was not about to let the elements destroy the family she had fought so hard to forge. She turned back to the guide, her resolute face a mask of iron. We leave in 10 minutes. Callahan looked at her. He saw the fierce, unyielding devotion in her eyes. He realized that this woman was not just a protector. She was a miracle. A man like him, broken and discarded by the world, did not deserve such a companion. Yet he found himself incapable of refusing her strength. He pushed himself up from the floor. He leaned against her, allowing her to bear the majority of his weight. They moved toward the iron cot. Rowena wrapped her daughter in the thickest wool blankets they owned, binding the child securely against her own massive, muscular chest with a leather harness. Are you ready? The giant woman looked at the man. Callahan nodded, his hand gripping her thick arm. I am. They walked toward the heavy wooden doors. Outside, the sky had turned a violent, bruised black. The wind was whipping the snow into a horizontal frenzy. The first gusts of the superstorm beginning to slam against the structure of the church. Rowena kicked the doors open. The wall of white wind hit them with the force of a tidal wave. She took the first step into the blinding dark, the weight of the man and the child pulling heavily against her spine. Suddenly, a massive crash echoed from the street behind them. The bell tower of the chapel, weakened by years of neglect and the sheer force of the incoming gale, began to sway. The heavy timber supports groaned with a sound of splintering wood. The colossal iron bell began to detach from the rafters above the entrance. Rowena froze, the immense weight of the protector and the child pinning her to the threshold. She looked up. The heavy, rusted iron of the bell was plummeting directly toward them. Rowena did not think. The instinct of the mother took absolute control. She lunged forward, her chunky leather boots finding purchase in the frozen mud of the yard. She threw the entire, immense weight of her massive body to the side, shielding her daughter with her own broad back. The air around her displaced violently as the colossal iron bell smashed into the earth. The impact was so severe it sent a shockwave through the ground, vibrating up through the thick, powerful thighs of the giant woman and rattling her teeth. The heavy iron bell landed inches from the threshold, shattering the stone foundation of the chapel. A cloud of frozen dust and splintered wood exploded into the air, obscuring the world in a white, blinding haze. Rowena did not wait to see the destruction. She kept moving, her massive frame propelled by a surge of adrenaline that ignored the brutal biting cold of the superstorm. She did not stop until they had cleared the debris and reached the edge of the silent, snow-buried street. The wind had transformed into a living, screaming entity. It tore at the heavy wool blankets wrapped around the child, and it whipped the torn fabric of her gray dress against her thick, muscular legs. Callahan, secured against her massive back by a heavy leather harness, gripped her shoulders. His heavy, calloused fingers were locked tight, a silent testament to his reliance on her unyielding strength. "The main road is closed." The voice of the mountain man was a desperate shout, barely audible over the roaring gale. "We must take the high ridge." Rowena nodded, her resolute face a mask of frozen determination. She adjusted the heavy weight of the man and the sleeping child, feeling the steady, rhythmic warmth of their bodies against her own. She was carrying the most precious burden of her life, and she refused to stumble. She turned toward the dark, rising slope of the mountain, her massive frame pushing into the heart of the storm. The climb was a brutal test of endurance. The superstorm had erased the trail. Every step was a gamble. She had to navigate by the familiar, primal instincts of the land, sensing the subtle dips in the earth beneath the deep drifts of powder. Her massive, heavily calloused hands moved instinctively to maintain her balance. Her thick, powerful thighs driving through the snow with the force of a battering ram. Callahan watched the world through the narrow slits of his eyes, the biting cold threatening to freeze the very moisture from his sight. He felt the immense power of the woman moving beneath him. He felt the steady pulse of her heart, the reliable, deep rhythm of a life force that did not know how to quit. A profound, shattering realization washed over the stoic protector. He had spent his entire life believing that he was a ghost, a man destined to wander the edges of existence, forever apologizing to the spirits of the family he could not save. He had lived behind the walls of his own grief, convinced that he was beyond the reach of human connection. But as the wind screamed around them, and the freezing dark threatened to claim their lives, he did not feel the cold. He felt the warmth of the mother. He felt the small, steady breathing of the child against her back. He realized, with a clarity that stung more than the winter, that he was no longer alone. He was part of a fortress. He was part of a family. He rested his heavy head against the broad shoulder of the woman, his calloused hand gently patting the small, bundled form of the child. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a promise to protect the future that he had so desperately sought to save. The storm intensified. The visibility dropped to zero. They were climbing into the white void, guided only by the shared, unbreakable will to survive. "We are close to the summit," Rowena shouted, her voice raspy from the cold. She pushed her massive, muscular body upward, the heavy muscles of her back and shoulders straining with every agonizing, vertical step. Her boots found purchase on a hidden, solid surface. She paused, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. She reached out with her free hand, feeling the surface beneath the snow. It was smooth. It was hard. It was not the natural stone of the mountain. It was an ancient, man-made structure. "The ice bridge," Callahan whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The ancient wooden bridge, a forgotten relic of the early timber harvest, spanned the deep, jagged abyss that separated the lower ridge from the high plateau. It was a terrifying structure of rotting, frozen timber and rusted iron chains, suspended over a darkness that had no bottom. In the calm of a summer day, the crossing was a challenge for the bravest of men. In the howling fury of a superstorm, it was a death trap. Rowena stepped onto the first plank. The wood groaned, a long, agonizing sound that vibrated through the structure. "It is rotting," the mother murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her knees. "We do not have another choice," the mountain man replied, his grip tightening on her broad shoulders. "If we do not cross, the storm will bury us here." Rowena took another step. The massive, heavy boots of the woman moved with a predator's grace, her balance absolute even with the weight of two souls upon her spine. She kept her center of gravity low, her massive, thick thighs working in perfect, rhythmic harmony with the shifting of the bridge. The wind shrieked, threatening to tilt the entire structure into the abyss. Callahan held his breath, his eyes fixed on the narrow, swaying path ahead. He could feel the bridge swaying under their combined weight, the ancient iron chains rattling against the freezing rock walls. They reached the center of the span. The bridge was covered in a thick layer of black ice. The surface was slick, dangerous, and completely unforgiving. Rowena adjusted her stance, her massive, heavily calloused hands gripping the iron railing for stability. She looked down for a single, terrified second into the yawning, black mouth of the canyon. The bridge gave a sharp, violent lurch. The wooden plank beneath the right boot of the giant woman snapped with the sound of a pistol shot. The entire structure twisted, throwing them toward the edge of the abyss. Rowena screamed, throwing her massive weight to the left to counteract the momentum. The iron railing groaned, the rusted bolts pulling free from the stone wall with a screech of shearing metal. She scrambled, her massive, muscular body lashing out to find purchase on the remaining intact timber. She succeeded, but the sudden, jarring stop caused the bridge to vibrate violently. Under the weight of the massive woman and the man she carried, the central support beam of the bridge emitted a long, sustained crack that echoed through the mountain. Callahan looked down at the gap opening between the planks beneath their feet. The rope securing the bridge to the mountain wall was fraying rapidly, the sharp, jagged stone edge sawing through the twisted fiber with every gust of the gale. The rope began to snap, strand by strand, like the beating of a terrified heart. The snap of the rope echoed against the canyon walls like the crack of a lightning bolt. Rowena did not hesitate. The towering giant of a woman threw her massive weight forward, her chunky leather boots finding purchase on the icy lip of the ledge. just as the wooden bridge beneath them disintegrated. The structure fell away into the dark abyss with a sickening, grinding roar of splintering timber and twisting iron chains. They collapsed together onto the snow-covered stone of the high plateau. The massive, muscular back of the mother shielded the falling man and the small child from the violent impact. Silence rushed back into the gap left by the bridge, filled only by the screaming fury of the superstorm. Rowena lay still for a heartbeat, her immense chest heaving with the force of her exertion. She felt the steady, rapid thrumming of the child against her harness and the heavy, warm pressure of the mountain man against her spine. They were alive. They had survived the fall of the mountain itself. Callahan stirred, his hands trembling as he pushed himself up from the ground. He looked back at the gaping maw of the abyss, where the bridge had stood only moments before. His sharp, observant eyes were wide with a profound, terrifying awe. He looked at the giant woman who had physically held them together through the collapse, his gaze softening into a look of absolute, unconditional adoration. The path ahead, the mountain man rasped, his voice barely audible above the gale, is the vertical face of the ridge. Rowena stood up, her massive frame rising like a monolith against the white-out conditions. She turned to face the challenge. Before them rose a sheer wall of dark, frozen stone and solid ice. It was a climb that would defy any normal traveler. It required balance, precision, and an almost superhuman grip. She turned her head, looking at the protector. I have the strength to climb. You have the knowledge of the route. We do this as one. Callahan reached into the satchel of the woman. He produced a long, thick coil of rope, the only tool they had left. He looped it around his waist and secured the other end to the broad, thick belt of the woman. He did not ask her to carry him. He knew his own injury would make him a liability if she had to haul his full weight. He intended to climb. His teeth gritted against the fire of his wounded leg. The ascent began. Rowena moved with the deliberate grace of a predator. She placed her massive, heavily collused hands against the freezing stone, testing every hold before trusting her weight to the rock. Her thick, powerful thighs acted as the engine of their survival, driving her frame upward. She moved slowly, ensuring that every movement was calculated to keep her balance secure. Callahan followed closely behind. He utilized the anchor of the rope, relying on the stability of the mother to catch him should his grip falter. The pain in his leg was a dull, rhythmic throb that threatened to cloud his vision, but he focused entirely on the broad, strong back of the woman. The wind grew in intensity. The freezing sleet began to form a crust on the rock face, making every handhold slippery and treacherous. The trust between them deepened with every inch of altitude. They did not need to speak. Rowena moved, and Callahan followed. Callahan signaled, and Rowena adjusted. They were a singular unit, two souls bound by the desperate need to reach the safety of the summit. The physical struggle was immense. Rowena felt the heavy muscles of her powerful biceps burning with the strain of hauling her own weight. The child, and the tension of the guide. Her broad shoulders were taut, every fiber of her body working in perfect unison. She did not feel the cold. The internal heat of her exertion provided a shield against the frost. Halfway up the vertical wall, the rock face transitioned from solid stone to a slick sheet of blue ice. Rowena paused. Her massive fingers hooked into a small crevice. She could feel the vibration of the storm deep within the mountain. The ice is thin here, the mountain man warned. His voice, a low, steady rumble near her ear. Dig with the heel of your boot. Seek the stone beneath the frost. Rowena did not question the instruction. She trusted the man with her life. She struck the heel of her chunky leather boot against the ice, shattering the brittle surface. She found the solid rock beneath. She moved upward, her strength and his knowledge acting as the catalyst for their progress. The vertical ascent felt like a climb toward the heavens. The world below had vanished, swallowed by the swirling white void of the storm. There was only the rock, the ice, and the man and the woman bound by the rope. The emotional connection between them had transcended the bounds of mere survival. It was a profound, silent language of reliance. Rowena felt the weight of the man behind her not as a burden, but as a commitment. He was the anchor to her strength, and she was the pillar for his resolve. As they neared the top of the ridge, the wind became an unbearable force, pushing against their bodies with the weight of a giant hand. Rowena reached the final ledge. She drove her massive hands into the deep snow of the summit, hauling her frame upward. She scrambled onto the flat expanse of the peak, her lungs gasping for the thin, freezing air. She immediately turned back, her massive, calloused hand reaching down to catch the guide. Callahan grabbed her wrist. His fingers were locked around her thick forearm, his grip firm and steady. "I have you," the mother breathed, the force of her conviction cutting through the scream of the gale. She hauled him up. The mountain man tumbled onto the flat stone of the summit, his chest heaving. He reached out, his rough, calloused hands cupping the strong, resolute face of the woman. He stared into her eyes. The blizzard raged around them, but in the center of the storm, there was only the quiet, intense gaze of two people who had looked into the face of death and refused to blink. "We are here," the mountain man whispered, his voice filled with a reverence that spoke of a new beginning. Rowena pressed her forehead against his, the warmth of their connection, providing the only true shelter against the elements. She felt the profound trust that had blossomed in the dark, a sturdy, beautiful thing that could withstand any winter. She turned to look toward the path that led down the far side of the mountain, toward the safety of the timberline. A sharp, metallic rasping sound pulled her gaze back to the rope that still bound them together. The rope had caught on the jagged, razor-sharp edge of an outcropping near the edge of the ledge. With every gust of the wind that tugged at their bodies, the fiber of the cord pulled tighter against the stone. Rowena watched, her heart stopping in her chest, as the thick, heavy rope began to fray. Strand by strand, the weave of the life-saving tether was separating. The jagged rock was sawing through the rope, the fibers unraveling into a loose, dangerous mess. The connection that kept them anchored to the safety of the ridge was slowly, inevitably, coming apart. Callahan followed her gaze. He looked at the rope, then at the abyss that waited just a few feet away. The storm seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if waiting for the final, decisive action. Rowena reached out, her massive, heavily calloused fingers closing around the fraying section of the rope. The material was wet and slick. She knew this, with a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, that the remaining strands would not hold the combined weight of two people for more than a few seconds. She looked at the man. She saw the realization dawning in his eyes, the understanding that the mountain had not yet finished its demand for a price. The rope groaned. The final, strongest strand of the weave popping, with a sharp, terrifying finality against the sharp stone. The final strand of the rope gave way with a sound that seemed to shatter the wind. The weight of the guide suddenly shifted, his broad body dropping inches into the void before the remaining fibers of the cord pulled taut against the edge of the granite. The rope groaned. A high, strained note that vibrated through the freezing air. Callahan looked down. He saw the black, bottomless nothingness waiting a mere few feet below the heels of his boots. He looked up, his sharp, observant eyes locking onto the resolute, terrified face of the giant woman. He understood the mathematics of the mountain. He was a massive man, and the added weight of his presence was tearing the woman from her own hold on the ridge. He reached toward his belt. His calloused fingers found the hilt of the hunting knife he had retrieved from the hearth in the chapel. He began to draw the blade. Cut the cord. The voice of the mountain man was a roar. A command of absolute, selfless finality. If you do not sever the line, the mountain will take us both. Rowena did not look at the knife. She did not look at the abyss. She looked only at the man who had stood between her and the wolves. The man who had climbed a frozen hell to save her child. I will not. The refusal of the mother was a primal scream of defiance against the cruelty of the world. She did not let go. Instead, she reached out with her free hand, grabbing the fraying, wet rope with a grip of pure, unyielding iron. She wrapped the rope around her own muscular forearm. She pulled the coils tight, driving the coarse fiber deep into the heavy, exposed skin of her biceps. The pain of the rope digging into her flesh was immense. A searing, white-hot fire. But she did not blink. She braced her massive, thick thighs against a natural indentation in the stone of the ridge. She leaned her entire body weight backward, her back arching, the veins in her neck bulging with the unimaginable strain of holding the two of them, and the child against the gravity of the mountain. Do not you dare let go of me. The command of the woman was a low, guttural growl that possessed more authority than any law of man. She pulled. The muscles in the arms of the giant woman swelled to their absolute limit. Her heavy, muscular frame trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer, violent expenditure of every ounce of power she possessed. The rock beneath her boots scraped. She slipped a fraction of an inch. She roared again. A sound of pure, maternal, and romantic ferocity that seemed to push back the very gale of the storm. She hauled backward. A single, and agonizing, slow pull that defied the physics of the summit. Callahan felt the sudden change in the tension. He saw the face of the woman, red with exertion, her eyes wide and burning with a love so intense it felt like a physical heat. He realized, in that moment, that she was not just holding him, she was claiming him. She was rewriting the destiny of his life, refusing to let him be the victim of the mountain anymore. He stopped reaching for the knife. He let his hand fall to his side, his fingers brushing against the rough, cold stone. He allowed himself to trust her. He allowed himself to be saved. With one final, earth-shattering heave, Rowena dragged the towering mountain man over the lip of the ridge. They collapsed together onto the flat, frozen ground of the summit. The rope fell slack, the frayed ends whipping uselessly in the wind. Rowena rolled onto her back, her massive chest heaving, her heavy, muscular arms shaking uncontrollably. She gasped for air, the cold stinging her lungs. But she was laughing. A soft, breathless, and broken sound of pure, triumphant joy. Callahan crawled toward her. He did not care about the storm. He did not care about the freezing cold. He reached out and gathered the massive, strong form of the woman into his own broad embrace. He pressed his face against the neck of the giant mother, his hands gripping her thick, heavy coat as if she were the only solid thing in a universe of chaos. You did not let go. The whisper of the man was ragged, filled with a wonder that transcended his exhaustion. Rowena turned, her hand coming up to cup the back of his neck. She pulled his head down, resting her forehead against his. I have spent my life holding up the weight of a cruel world, the woman murmured, her voice steady and warm. I was never going to let you fall. The moment was a profound, major emotional turning point. The barrier of his stoic protection and the wall of her fierce independence had finally dissolved. They were no longer two survivors sharing a path. They were a singular, unified force. The fear of loss, which had haunted them both for so long, had been replaced by the quiet, radiant certainty of belonging. They remained on the summit for long, precious minutes, protected by the very earth they had conquered. The child, still strapped to the chest of the mother, let out a soft, rhythmic sigh. The fever, finally, fully broken. The wind began to shift. The violence of the superstorm, having exhausted its fury against the defiance of the two giants, began to mellow into a steady, freezing draft. The timberline is ahead, Callahan said, his voice stronger now, though his body remained weak. There is a ranger station not 2 miles down the eastern slope. It will be warm. It will be safe. Rowena stood up. She did not need the rope now. She reached down and helped the man to his feet. She kept one arm wrapped firmly around his waist, her massive frame supporting his gait as they began the final descent. The journey was easier than the climb. The path was clear, and the rage of the blizzard had subsided into a biting, manageable cold. They walked as one, the powerful, rhythmic stride of the giant woman, setting the pace for the limping, weary man. As the first dark silhouettes of the pine trees appeared through the swirling mist of the night, the exhausted frame of the guide began to sag. The ranger station came into view, a small, sturdy cabin of logs tucked into the lee of a rocky overhang. Rowena kicked the door open. The interior was empty, but it was dry. There was a stockpile of dry wood near the hearth. She helped Callahan toward the sleeping bunk in the corner. He moved with a heavy, uncoordinated motion, his eyes struggling to stay open. She laid him down on the thick, woolen blankets, her hands moving with practiced, efficient care to strip away his frozen outer layers. She tended to his wound, the bandage now soaked through with blood and melted snow. She cleaned the area with the last of their clean water, binding it with a fresh, dry cloth. She turned to start a fire in the hearth. She worked quickly, the heat of the flames soon filling the small, wooden room. She returned to the bunk, intending to check on her daughter and then tend to the exhaustion of the man. She sat beside him on the edge of the cot. "We are safe," she whispered, her hand resting gently on the broad, weathered chest of the protector. "We made it home." Callahan looked at her. He offered a small, weak smile, the first true expression of peace she had ever seen on his face. "I am tired," the mountain man breathed, his eyes heavy with the weight of the last 3 days. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing the side of her strong, resolute face one last time. Then, next, his hand fell limp against the blankets. Rowena leaned forward, her heart skipping a beat. She placed her ear against his chest, listening for the strong, steady rhythm she had relied upon throughout the climb. She heard nothing but a faint, slow fluttering, like a bird trapped in a cage. She shook his shoulder, her voice rising in a sudden, sharp note of panic. Callahan. Open your eyes. The mountain man did not move. He did not stir. He remained perfectly, terrifyingly still, his face sinking into a mask of gray, impenetrable exhaustion. The cabin was warm, but a new, deeper chill began to creep into the bones of the giant woman. She stood over the sleeping man, the silence of the room becoming a deafening, terrifying roar. He was not waking up. And as the fire in the hearth flickered, she realized that the greatest struggle of her life was not the mountain, the wolves, or the fever. It was the terrifying possibility that she had carried him to safety, only to watch him fade into the dark. The silence in the ranger station was a physical weight. Rowena stood over the narrow cot, her breath hitching in her massive chest. The man who had faced the wolves and the heights for her sake was fading into the shadows of his own mind. She did not wait for the morning. She knew the ranger station was merely a shell of wood and iron, devoid of the poultices and warmth necessary to pull a man back from the edge of the winter. She needed her own home, the homestead she had built with her bare hands, the place where she kept the medicinal roots, and the heavy quilts that held the heat of the fire. She moved with the efficiency of a titan. She bundled the sleeping child into the heavy, fur-lined harness against her chest, and she gathered the unconscious mountain man, wrapping him in every blanket available. She hoisted his immense, dead weight onto her back, his arms draped limply over her shoulders. He was a mountain of bone and muscle, cold to the touch. Yet he was the most precious cargo she had ever hauled. The trek back to the settlement was a blur of frozen white and howling wind. The storm had broken, leaving the mountain in a state of crystalline, terrifying stillness. Rowena walked with a steady, relentless stride, her thick, powerful thighs churning through the drifts. She did not feel the fatigue. She felt only the terrifying rhythm of Callahan's heart against her spine, a flutter that threatened to cease with every passing mile. She reached her small cabin on the edge of the valley as the first light of dawn stained the horizon. She kicked the door open, the interior of the home cool but dry. She laid him onto her own bed, the sturdy frame creaking under his weight. For 3 days, the cabin became a sanctuary of labor and vigil. Rowena moved between the fire and the bed, her movements precise and hushed. She brewed tea from the bitter herbs. She kept the iron stove roaring, and she pressed cool, damp cloths to the forehead of the feverish man. He was not truly present. He drifted in a sea of his own making, his eyes darting beneath heavy, dark lids as if he were watching a tragedy unfold upon a distant stage. "The wind is inside the walls," he whispered, his voice a jagged, broken rasp. "I cannot block the cold. It comes for them. It comes for all of them." Rowena sat on the edge of the bed, her massive hand resting gently upon his broad, sun-bronzed chest. She listened, her heart aching with a profound, crushing sorrow. "It is gone, Callahan," she murmured, her voice a low, lyrical song intended to soothe the storm in his mind. "The frost cannot reach this room." He did not hear her. He reached out, his hand clutching at the air, his fingers seeking a hold that was no longer there. "Elena." I could not hold the lantern. The ice, it was too thick. The children, they were sleeping, but the house was so cold. Rowena froze. The name hung in the air like a ghost. She looked down at the weathered face of the mountain man, seeing the deep, ancient grief that had carved those lines into his skin. He was not talking about the valley, or the fever of her child. He was speaking of a different winter. A different tragedy. He was speaking of the night he had lost everything. I promised to protect them, he groaned, his body twisting on the blankets. But I was just one man. I was just one man. And the mountain was so much larger than my courage. Rowena felt a tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. She understood now. He had not been merely reclusive or unfeeling. He had been a man serving a life sentence in a prison of his own guilt. He had been walking the ridges for a decade, waiting for the mountain to finish the job it had started years ago. He had saved her and her child not because he wanted to live, but because he believed he was finally paying a debt to the ghosts that followed him. "You are not a failure," she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "You are the man who crossed the ice to bring a mother back to her child. You are the man who faced the fangs of the dark to protect a stranger. You have done more than enough." She kept her hand on his heart, pouring every ounce of her strength into the rhythm of his life. She stayed there, a giant woman anchoring a broken man, refusing to let the current of his grief pull him under. The days bled into nights. The fever finally broke on the fourth morning. The silence of the cabin was total. The fire had burned down to a gentle, golden glow, and the morning sun filtered through the frosted panes of the window, painting the room in soft, amber light. Callahan stirred. His eyes fluttered open. They were clear, the feverish haze replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He lay still, his gaze tracking the rafters of the cabin. He shifted his head, his senses slowly returning to the world. He waited for the sound of the woman. He waited for the rustle of the hearth, the rhythmic movement of the mother who had dragged him through the abyss. He heard nothing. The cabin was perfectly, eerily still. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. He looked toward the kitchen area, expecting to see the massive silhouette of the giant woman, perhaps brewing the bitter tea or tending to the child. The table was empty. The hearth was cold. A sharp, cold jolt of panic, colder than any winter he had ever endured, shot through his chest. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet hitting the wooden floor. He stood, his balance precarious, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Rowena?" The name left his lips, a shaky, desperate sound that seemed to vanish into the rafters without an answer. He looked toward the bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. He walked toward it, his hand trembling as he reached out to push the wood open. He stepped into the main room of the cabin, the space feeling vast and impossibly vacant. The house was empty. The blankets on the chairs were folded. The hearth was swept clean, and the heavy leather harness the mother had used to carry her daughter hung silently on a peg by the door. There was no sign of her. He turned to the window, his breath hitching. He searched the snow-covered clearing outside, looking for the towering form of the giant woman, hoping to see her hauling timber or walking the fence line. Nothing. The mountain was silent. The valley was still. Callahan stood in the center of his own home. The man who had survived the mountain, now facing a desertion he could not comprehend. Where had the Titan gone? What had he missed while he slept in the dark? The silence was the answer he feared most of all. He moved to the table, his hand resting upon the rough wood. There, lying in the center of the surface, was a single object. It was the tattered, blue ribbon he had pulled from the ice in the gorge, the relic of his own failed past. Beside it lay a small note, written in a bold, sturdy hand. He picked up the paper, his heart clenching, and began to read. Callahan held the scrap of paper with hands that trembled like dry leaves in a gale. The handwriting was bold and steady. Etched into the fiber of the page with the same strength, Rowena poured into every task she undertook. You have carried this ghost long enough. Callahan. I found it in the gorge, and I know it belongs to a winter that has already passed. You do not need to hold on to the frost to remember the warmth of the people you loved. Keep the memory, but leave the pain here, in this house. I have taken the child to the edge of the creek to fetch the morning water. We will return before the sun touches the ridge. Do not go looking for us in the snow. Just be here when we come home. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sudden, sharp release. The crushing weight that had settled upon his chest, the terror of abandonment, the fear that he was once again the man left alone in a cold, silent room, evaporated. She had not left him. She had simply forced him to face the very thing he had been clutching for a decade. He looked down at the blue ribbon resting on the table. It looked fragile, almost pathetic, compared to the sturdy, tangible reality of the woman who had walked into his life and dragged him back from the edge of the abyss. He picked it up. He did not crush it, and he did not cast it into the fire. He folded it carefully, placing it inside a small wooden box he kept on the mantel, a place for keepsakes, not for birdsons. The realization hit him with the force of a sunrise. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost. He was a man being invited, day by day, to build what was next. Callahan moved to the door. His legs were still weak, aching with the residual pain of his wound and the strain of the climb. But the paralysis of his spirit was gone. He pushed the heavy timber door open. The morning was crisp, the air still and clean after the violence of the superstorm. The sun was beginning to crest over the high peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. He stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the edge of the clearing, where the creek wound its way through the pines. There, standing in the gentle light, was the giant woman. Rowena was not carrying a burden of sorrow or a weight of impossible labor. She stood near the frozen bank, her massive, muscular frame draped in a simple, heavy coat. She held the hand of her young daughter, who was wrapped in thick wool, looking healthy and bright. They were standing close, their silhouettes framed by the towering, ancient trees. Rowena looked down at the child, a smile touching her strong, resolute face, a sight so radiant it made the stoic protector pause in the doorway. He realized then that she was not just a survivor. She was a mother, a guardian, and now, the anchor of a life he had never dared to imagine. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the fresh, light powder. He did not run, and he did not rush. He simply walked toward them, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the only future he had ever wanted. Rowena turned as she heard the sound of his footsteps. She did not release the hand of her daughter, nor did she retreat. She simply stood, her towering presence commanding the landscape, her eyes meeting his with a quiet, powerful depth. They did not speak. There were no grand declarations to be made, no promises that needed to be shouted into the thin mountain air. The silence between them was no longer the tension of strangers or the frantic desperation of the dying. It was the comfortable, resonant silence of two people who had forged a bond in the deepest dark. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at the daughter, the child he had nearly died to help, now vibrant and alive. He looked at the woman, the giant who had refused to let him give up, who had shown him that his strength was not gone, merely dormant, waiting to be used for something other than penance. Rowena reached out her free hand. She did not grab him or pull him. She simply extended her palm. An invitation to close the distance. Callahan stepped forward, placing his calloused hand into hers. Her grip was firm, warm, and absolute. It was the handshake of a partner, the touch of a lover, and the commitment of a protector. He stood there, the sun warming his face, the cold wind forgotten. He was no longer the ghost of the ridge. He was home. The mountain is a harsh teacher, but it is also a mirror. It reflects back to us the truth of our own capacity for endurance. When we find ourselves standing in the blinding white of a life-changing storm, we often believe that we must face the wind alone. We think that our wounds are our only identity, and that our failures are a permanent map of our future. But stories like this serve as a reminder that resilience is not a solitary act. It is a shared endeavor. True strength is not found in the absence of pain, but in the decision to keep walking despite it. It is found in the willingness to let someone else carry the load when our own muscles begin to fail. It is found in the courage to let go of the ghosts that haunt our yesterday, so that we might finally see the beauty of the life waiting for us today. We all carry ribbons of our own faded, frozen remnants of losses we cannot seem to leave behind. But healing does not come from erasing the past. It comes from building a home so sturdy, so warm, and so full of love, that the winter no longer has the power to define who we are. Second chances do not arrive with fanfare. They do not come with promises of an easy path or a life without snow. They arrive in the quiet moments, the steadying hand on a shoulder, the shared silence by a hearth, the simple decision to trust, just once more, in the goodness of another soul. And if we are brave enough to accept that hand, we find that the mountain, for all its cruelty, was never the end of the road. It was simply the challenge we had to climb, to find where we truly belonged. May you always find your shelter, and may you never have to walk the ridge alone. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, situations, and events portrayed are products of the author's imagination, or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental.